Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I am a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and joining me today is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And Tho, let's talk a little bit about Jill Biden. Where not someone we usually talk about, but she caught my attention where she had this ridiculous pandering speech to some sort of Latino Hispanic group in San Antonio. And she was trying to show how she understands the ways of American Hispanics. You know, just the typical sort of thing you get from someone who grew up in the Beltway and has lived a life of privilege and has probably not met any Mexican Americans who didn't work for her. And so just this whole situation where she's delivering this speech and talking about the bodegas of the Bronx. She meant bodega, I guess. And I'm not remotely a New Yorker, but I know that it's pronounced bodega. So I don't know where this woman's been living. I mean, I live on Earth in America, so I'm kind of familiar with some of these words. And then talking about how Hispanics are diverse, like the breakfast tacos of San Antonio. Now, this provoked a bit of an overreaction, I think, from a lot of Hispanic groups, chief among them being Mayra Flores, the new Republican congresswoman from South Texas, who made a big deal about how we are not tacos, and then like a Hispanic journalism group said, yeah, we're not tacos. I don't think she was really saying that, but what was offensive was just the blatant pandering to this ethnic group and this ridiculous attempt to show how she was one of them. And so the whole thing really, I think, kind of highlights and the not so much just her comment, but that was relevant and I think really raised the issue of, especially in the blowback, the fact that there really is a fight brewing and going now over, are Hispanics going to be Republicans or are they going to be Democrats as a group? The reality, of course, is probably going to be a split somewhere between 40 and 60%, but it's been obvious for years, right, that this isn't like black voters in the Democratic Party where it's like 80, 90, 95% support the Democrats, and then there's just this tiny minority. But you've been hearing a growing news about how lots of Latino Hispanic voters have been voting more and more for the GOP, especially in South Texas, probably less so in California because those are two different types of people. But now there's even talk about it being just really relevant in the 2022 midterms. And I tend to be skeptical that it's going to make that big a difference. But I know from talking to you that you've seen some reports of like maybe some major shifts there. And of course, we're not just talking about Mexican Americans either, talking about a much larger Hispanic group incorporating Puerto Ricans and Cuban exiles and all of these groups. But what's your take on it? Should I think that there's going to be this major change, or is it just going to be more of a gradual creep? Or do we just have no idea where this is headed at all?
Well, I think one of the interesting punchlines about the whole Jill Biden thing is that the group that she was speaking to is literally called the Latinx Inclusion Luncheon, which inclusion has an X in the middle, not quite sure why. And if you're going out there doing an event, called the Latinx Inclusion Luncheon, guess what? There's not a lot of inclusion going on there in terms of actual, Texas Hispanic voters, given all of the ways that we've seen, the entire Latinx whitewashing sort of, it requires a postgraduate degree to understand why they're trying to do this style of rhetoric. And of course, this is exactly the problem that the Democratic Party is happening right now. And it's interesting, I know we've talked in the past, some of my favorite stuff from Murray Rothbard's, political history is his discussions about the rise and falls of party systems. And I think what you're seeing right now is very much, there's this sort of realignment that I think at times, that there's aspects that might be, they kind of seem as superficial, right? You replace the George Bush era cowboy hat with sort of the Trump MAGA hat. You have different types of commentators out there, but ultimately a lot of the people behind the scenes are the same. A lot of the ideas, to the extent that there are ideas in American politics, are the same. I think what we're seeing right now is that, particularly, obviously, wouldn't surprise me at all if Trump runs again in 2024. We're not necessarily in a post-Trump moment politically, but the motivation right now with voters is less about Trump and more just a reflection of the perception of where the modern Democratic Party is. And if you start breaking down some of the polls that came out, I mean, there's a very interesting Axios article that was breaking down a few different polls out there. How about this number? Currently, Democrats are statistically tied with Republicans among Hispanics on kind of the generic congressional ballot that come out there. Now, of course, that's kind of a nationwide survey. It's not looking down at some of the kind of particular hotspot areas, such as South Texas and some of these areas. But in 2018, not that long ago, 2018, Democrats held a 47-point edge with this same group. Now it's tied. These sort of demographics, and what we're seeing is the Democratic Party is becoming the party of overeducated white people, for the most part, right? That is the strongest. The ideal Democratic voter in 2022 is a dog mom with a postgraduate degree, that watches CNN and takes it seriously, right? It is a very different demographic than it was, 2016, that sort of Obama era coalition. There's interesting things going on with younger voters where, I think it's like 95% of younger voters don't want to see Biden run again. There's a kind of a disconnect between the new generation of Democrats that are more in the AOC mode, if you're going to, use a very superficial connection there, to, against the standing Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein era of Democratic politics. And it's just interesting. We're seeing play out right now a genuine realignment, really an end of a political system and the birth of a new one. And that just, it's going to be interesting to see where all this ends up, because, there's a possibility here, right, where, the institutions that really sort of create the policy of political parties, the result of all this might not be grand in scale. That remains to be seen, but the actual makeup of these party systems is very different than what it used to be.
Yeah, and it's difficult for a lot of people to comprehend just how diverse politically and ideologically and ethnically even Hispanics are. So you have to make all the same sorts of caveats that you would with quote unquote white people, right? With non-Hispanic whites, right? So of course you're going to hear from AOC type people, whose father was an engineer, by the way. So again, the Democrat coming from a much more privileged background than Flores down in Texas, whose parents were immigrants, Mexican-born immigrants, and then came here and became laborers, is my understanding. And so AOC tried to play up her suffering as a recent immigrant, but it turned out that she lived in this very nice house in New York. And so that, I think, just in microcosm highlights some of those big distinctions that can take place. But as you say, just as with non-Hispanic whites, you got people with graduate degrees and you got people with a high school degree. That's a pretty big difference. And that certainly can make a big difference, too, in terms of Hispanics then, right? Are we talking about someone who owns a auto repair shop in San Antonio? Or are we talking about someone who has a law degree from UCLA and now lives in Pasadena? So the fact that both of those people might label themselves as Hispanic doesn't tell us a whole lot. That one point doesn't tell us a whole lot about how they might vote. But you might argue that a lot of this is just also dependent upon the fact that the more time goes on, and especially as the number of Hispanics from Latin, or the number of immigrants from Latin America goes down as a percentage of the total number of immigrants to the United States. The number of Mexican Americans coming to the U.S. as a percentage of total immigrants has gone down significantly. And a lot of what you're getting now are Central Americans. And so the populations are very different in terms of immigration. But you also have the issue of the longer people are here, the more they just identify with native-born groups and with people who are thought of as white. And you can see that in the data. And look back, first of all, at the fact that when did you have major waves of Hispanic immigration? You had a lot in the 90s, but you also had a lot. The first major waves, really, since the Mexican War, came in the teens and in the early 20s. And this was a result of the Mexican Revolution that was taking place down there, lots of upheaval. And so you had a lot of new immigrants come into the country, mostly into South Texas, into El Paso, and also just straight into places like Chicago as well in many cases. And so that was a huge number of people who are Hispanics in America today are descended from those people who came to the United States, what's now almost 110 years ago. And so you can think about then, well, how long have those families, those people been in the United States? Well, those people are at least third generation now. And that's me. Like, my grandparents came from Mexico to the United States around 1915. My grandmother was born in Chihuahua in 1910. Her parents brought her here in the 20s. She grew up on both sides of the border. And so that makes me third generation. That's enough time then for also her descendants to intermarry with non-Hispanic whites living in the United States or with other groups, which we know is rampant. We know from data that just take some random Hispanic community, and it looks like you have about, especially you look at a community like Albuquerque, Denver, Southern California, you've got 30% rates of intermarriage in any given generation, so that there's not in any way this hard, bright line between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanics. And so you've got all that intermarriage then after 3 generations. You've just got the fact that people then identify much more so with just growing up in the United States than with any idea of where their grandparents came from. And we can see that reflected in the data. Every time I see this stuff about how in 2045, here's a headline from Brookings Institution, in 2045, whites will be a minority, Census projects. And we've talked about that before, about how, well, that's an oddly specific year. That's going to be 2045. And how do they come to that conclusion? Well, one thing to always remember about census projections is that they assume that the descendants of current, quote unquote, non-whites will always be non-whites. So if your parents were counted as Hispanics, or just one of your parents, then you'll be counted for sure as Hispanic. But then if you marry a non-Hispanic, your children will nonetheless be considered Hispanic. So in 2045, what the census is using is all of these quote-unquote Hispanic children of couples where only one of the parents was Hispanic. So it's totally arbitrary the way they're counting this stuff. They're like massively overcounting the number of people who consider their Hispanic identity to be extremely important. But even then, among those people who think of themselves as Hispanic, never forget that at least half of them also consider themselves white. So I don't know if non-Hispanics notice this on like the census check sheets and when you're applying for scholarships and stuff. There's always 2 questions. There's what is your race and are you Hispanic? These are 2 different things because Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnic group. And you can check a combination of those. And what the census data has even found is that about 50% of Hispanics also check the white box. So anytime you're looking at something like Brookings that says, oh, look, it's only going to be 49% white in 2045, what they're excluding is all Hispanics from that, even though half of those people generally consider themselves to be white. So if you really look at that, then even in 2045, according to the census projection, more than 60% of the country is still white, quote unquote, by their own projections. So the number's just bogus because it assumes that all Hispanics think of themselves as not white, which isn't remotely true. But I wonder if the census data is even understating that, because Pew did a survey a few years ago and they asked, hey, if you self-identify as Latino, what is your race? And among all Hispanics, it was 58% identify as white, and among U.S.-born Hispanics, 20% identified as white. So the whole concept then of the Democrats, they've got a lock on non-white people, well, maybe, but they never mention the fact that maybe 60% of these Hispanics they think they got a lock on actually think of themselves as white people. And so are they then just becoming white ethnics? And this has become an issue that's been discussed in some articles in places like The Atlantic and things like that, where headlines are around the lines of, well, Hispanics are just future white people, or they will become, quote unquote, ethnic whites. And because we have that term, we invented that term, right? Ethnic white people. And this we refer to like Eastern Europeans and Italians. People used to be considered subhuman 100 years ago, but then became white people at some point through an interesting transformation, which is discussed, by the way, in a book called Working Toward Whiteness by a guy named David Roediger. Where he just talks about how certain groups, which were once considered inferiors to whites, it also just kind of illustrates just kind of the arbitrariness of the whole label. Over time, over the last 100 years, then just merged into the white mass. Nobody talks about Italians as being non-whites anymore, or Poles as being non-whites, but they absolutely did back in the 1920s. So there's no reason that Hispanics can't undergo a similar transformation. Probably a major thing holding that back is the fact that the census back in the 70s under Nixon decided to just create this random category for Hispanics. They get this category all their own. Imagine if you had done that with Eastern Europeans or with people from the Middle East or something. It would be a totally different situation as we would think of as ethnicity in the United States. And a lot of that's just made up. And so just demographically, then, I think that the Democratic Party is trying to claim a monopoly on this entire group because they're supposedly people of color. Boy, there's a lot of gray area there, a lot of wiggle room, and it's just... they shouldn't be so confident at all that this is a group that's naturally going to think of themselves as, yeah, I don't really have anything in common with white people, so apparently I just must be a Democrat because those white people are out to get me. Well, the thing is that tons of Hispanics are married to white people, consider themselves white people, have white children, that sort of thing. So it's just really not a solid situation. It's something that's very much in flux.
Well, it's because, I mean, the basis of the Democratic Party is racial grievance politics. And so what it means to be a white person is to not be a victim in, modern American society. And I think that, that is an aspect where you have a lot of Hispanic Americans that are grateful to be in America. They don't hate America. And that is exactly the sort of tone that the Democratic Party has absorbed with this very, such a lazy word at this point, but that woke activist class, that this is the sort of stuff that's turning people away. And you break it down by the issues, and you see so many assumptions about what motivates Hispanic voters. I mean, for example, even the immigration issue. It's interesting. There was a breakdown on the Trump era, kind of where they really tightened up immigration during COVID, the Title 42 immigration policy down there. And, you had all of these pundits absolutely shocked that turns out that the majority of Hispanic voters supported those policies. And it was particularly true amongst Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. And the policy was least supported by Central Americans because it was it's people from Honduras and El Salvador that are being seen as the greatest benefactors of the open border situation, of kind of the chaotic border situation that's going on down there. And it's Mexican Americans That's what they're not in favor of that. They don't see themselves as benefiting from having an uncontrolled sort of border environment, in spite of the way that a lot of democratic strategies have kind of just been homogenizing this group as a whole. And this is what, of course, has also led to the rise of the headlines about the Hispanic face of white supremacy and all those sort of things. And this is, again, really, at the same time, this election is going to be very interesting because you have some very notable sort of Hispanic faces, particularly Hispanic women, female faces within kind of swing Texas districts. And you mentioned Mira Flores earlier. She won a special election for this term, so she's only has that office for half a year or so. She is then going to immediately go into the 2020 election there. That, I believe, is like a +9 historic district with the way that has been realigned after the 2020 census. That's now a +9 district. Okay, if she ends up winning that, like that now represents a major shift. I mean, this is a Hispanic majority Texas district. You have Casey Garcia, who is another in one of these majority Hispanic Texas districts that have taken a rightward swing. Monica De La Cruz, who lost last year by like 9,000 votes, but she's running again. And so, of course, the response to that is, you get CNN contributors saying that these Latina candidates are not the real deal because simply their policies don't subscribe with the political agenda that Hispanic politicians are supposed to be representing, right? And then, of course, if you look down the breakdown now of what are the issues that motivate Americans. I mean, this is again one of the very interesting ways in which you have, again, the left wing of the political operations of this country so disconnected, is that you can still see things like January 6th and democracy and climate change ranking amongst the top issues of, again, relatively affluent progressive voters. You look at the concerns of of Hispanic voters on average, and they look a lot more like working class white voters, right? They're concerned about crime, they're concerned about education, they're concerned about, in particular right now, inflation and gas prices and those sort of kitchen table issues. They're just viewing politics in a completely different orbit than what has now become the true leaders, the strategic arm of the modern American Democratic Party.
Yeah, that New York Times Siena College survey you sent me, right? Going back to that issue about the parity, basically, between whether you wanted Republicans or Democrats to control Congress, right? Among Hispanics and Latinos, it was right around 40%, either way, right? With 20% undecided or refused to answer. And so that's, of course, a generic ballot, right? But yeah, that's that should be pretty alarming if you're a Democrat, and to look out there and see that, oh, gee, only 41% of Hispanics want Democratic control of Congress, and 38% want control by Republicans. And again, I'm sure that varies by background and location. But on a nationwide basis, boy, you shouldn't really hang your agenda on just assuming that all of these people are going to turn out and vote for you in droves. And then, of course, what a lot of time that can happen, and this happened to Hillary, right, is that groups that you're assuming will come out and support you, they don't necessarily vote for the other guy, but they just stay home because you haven't offered them anything or you've treated them with contempt and so on. So that's a big danger there as well. And so I think that, yes, this could definitely make a lot of areas more competitive. And especially in Texas, I think, where looking at the sorts of Hispanics that are in Texas, they're different from people in California for the most part. And of course, as you pointed out with the Central Americans, right, how long your family's been in the country can definitely change your ideas. And of course, in some of these cases, some of these people have been in the country forever, in that they didn't even immigrate here, right? The border changed in 1848. and then they just found themselves on the U.S. side. And so those people are still counted as Hispanics, but to assume that they come down necessarily one way or the other on immigration, I mean, and those people have a lot of descendants now, right? You think of the number of descendants that one could have since the 1840s. That's a lot of people. And so they don't tie themselves to an immigration narrative necessarily at all. But what about some of these other states? I mean, you're in Florida. We've talked a lot about Texas. Floridians, Hispanics, they're not Mexican usually in origin. It's what, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, probably South American. My impression is that if you come to the United States from South America, you end up in Florida more so than you end up in Texas, with maybe the exclusion of Houston proper, perhaps. But what's your impression in terms of what's going on in that state?
Well, you really saw this play up. It's interesting because 2016 was obviously Trump still won Florida, but he significantly underperformed down in the Miami area. The 2018 race, when DeSantis won the governorship, he selected as his lieutenant governor Miss Nunez, who was a Miami area state senator. And she actually was able to keep her office down there rather than moving to Tallahassee. And that was purely as an outreach ploy to South Florida. And it worked. If you compare and contrast the maps there, South Florida was a big upgrade for Republicans over 2016. And that momentum continued. It was interesting, seeing, within 2020, some of the best sort of meme content that never really kind of took off in 2020 the same way it did for Trump in 2016. A lot of the really interesting sort of homemade content often came from Spanish language sort of content creators. In my experience, there was a whole like Trump boat parade song that was a little catchy. You've seen this sort of momentum continue to build. I think it's very likely that you're going to see DeSantis in 2022 win with the majority of Hispanic support within the state. Now, obviously, again, you have a little bit different dynamic there. Cubans, there's a growing Venezuelan population after the last few years, everything that's gone on down there. But this is another area though where you have the complete makeup of Florida itself is changing dramatically. I mean, you look at the Nate Silver, 538 polling right now. They're modeling, which you can go into a screed about the accuracy of these models. But their modeling has it that it is twice as likely that Ron DeSantis wins by 20 plus percentage points than he does losing at this point. Like that's how beyond the reach the state of Florida is right now, which is just it's really difficult to comprehend. Considering again, 2018, it was a 33,000 vote race. That's how much this state has swung since 2018. What's interesting, though, is that I think that now makes, the dynamic that is really driving, again, strength within the Democratic Party is, as mentioned earlier, education levels. And I think you're kind of seeing that play out with the reddening of Florida and kind of the purple now nature of Georgia, where it's college educated, postgraduate suburban areas within Georgia that are kind of swinging historical conservative districts to the Democrats. This is how we got 2 Georgia senators along with some other stuff there. That race again, like the Brian Kemp race, is probably far more competitive than DeSantis right now. And seeing those two, just the way these evolutions come, I think it's a very interesting illustration for what's going on more broadly. And you're seeing it kind of play out where, looking beyond Texas and Florida, where the Republicans are placing their chips right now are areas like Nevada, areas like New Mexico. Those, it's going to be those states that I think are going to become what historically places like Iowa and Ohio and Florida have used. Those areas have kind of come more predictably Republican. It's going to be the battleground states that Democrats are defending within kind of Nevada, New Mexico, some of his larger Hispanic states, and then it's going to be places like Georgia that are moving away from the right side and become more of those competitive districts. But this really is a national issue right now, and this is also kind of goes into the problems where if you're looking at generic national congressional maps, you have a lot of California factored in there where don't see that reddening anytime soon. But really, it's those swing states where some of these polling data right now is just it's very interesting just to see, again, seeing this play out right in front of our eyes in just the course of a couple of years.
Well, in looking back at the New York Times Siena College poll, looking at the issues that people think are important based on both Hispanic ethnicity and on education level, when you look at that data, it's clear that the most important issue for these people is the economy. For people with only some college or high school or less, and for people who self-identify as Hispanic, it's far and away the economy, jobs, stock market, and so on, is the number one concern. It's not abortion. It's not. It's for Hispanics. 2% say racism is the most important problem facing the country today, which matches up with the percentage of Hispanics that like the term Latinx. So that probably makes some sense right there as well. And I think part of the problem that the Democrats are having is that they've been increasingly losing the idea that they're the economic populist party. And so, hey, we care about you. We want to help regular people make a living, secure themselves financially, because all the talk is about transgenderism and that sort of thing. And people talking about how they don't know what a woman is and all of that stuff. And meanwhile, you got people worried about their jobs. And for Hispanics especially, who are aware of the issue of, hey, my parents or my grandparents came to this country and they worked super hard, and many of them were quote unquote good immigrants, right? They owned a liquor store or a corner shop or something like that and worked 6-7 days a week. And those people that think a lot about securing for themselves a good economic future and education for their children and that sort of thing. And if the Democratic Party is just never talking about that stuff because they're too busy talking about racial grievance or about sexual politics and so on, you could see how those people would just drift away and just stop caring.
Well, and you had a great illustration this week, Deering. This is how incompetent, just how insane the modern left is. You had a show hearing that was, all meant to kind of feed into the hysteria over the, reversal of Roe v. Wade. And, it's all about, abortion providers and things like that. And here you have a black legal scholar from Berkeley that decides to double down on the insane birthing person rhetoric and accuses Josh Hawley. Now, again, Josh Hawley loves, he knows how to get as much attention as possible. And so he's a master at that art. But she was able to give Josh Hawley the only part of that hearing that anybody is ever going to see by accusing him of inciting violence by simply saying that women can get pregnant. And they just can't help themselves. This was supposed to be a show trial to promote abortion good, and yet they have to double down on the insane language that the left is putting out there. And this is sort of stuff it's happening because they take this stuff actually seriously, right? They are actually ideologically more motivated by the importance of this inclusionary language of reshaping society than they do about helping the union worker, right? Like that is their higher priority. And it is reflected. They are true believers in this. And this is why it's difficult for them to pivot. Is the people that want to pivot are people like Nancy Pelosi, right? Like it's the cynical political actors within the Democratic Party that are saying like, okay, like this is going a little too crazy, right? But that's not where the base is. The base is the people that genuinely believe that Ron DeSantis is some sort of authoritarian fascist imposing, Christian nationalism on Florida, right? Like, and it's very difficult for them to win over people that don't think in that same way. And their entire platform right now, again, we've been talking about Hispanic voters. I'm interested to see the long-term trends of how reparations for slavery play into an American demographic that is increasingly, generations of Americans that weren't here during the Civil War, right? The differences between voting outcomes in between parents and, you know, either single, single people or families without kids, right? That dynamic where you're seeing a lot of emphasis placed on parental control of education, concerns about what's going on with indoctrination there. I mean, that's how you end up getting Virginia with a Republican governor who continues to poll pretty well. So it's not just sort of a backlash to some goofy comments that Terry McAuliffe has said. He's actually been able to maintain some popularity with his policies that are going to, concerns that actual American families have, rather than kind of the single activist types. And again, it very much is just, it's two different Americas, not simply in terms of policy prescriptions, but in terms of entire worldviews, cultural views, religious views. And again, I don't know how the Democratic Party gets itself out of its own way in the future when they genuinely believe in this. I mean, you look out there, you have Gavin Newsom right now. He's clearly running. I mean, he's doing all the little stops you're going to have to do right now, including spending advertising money in Florida, which I find amusing. Though, if you're a Democrat and you're actually trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we survive this burning down storm? Because there is another dynamic to this, right? Where it's very easy to fetishize these sort of silly little tangential issues when things are good. But when things are not good, and economically, Americans are feeling a lot of pain. Internationally, I mean, we're seeing massive protests all around the country, all around the world right now, of people, the obvious failures of the global policy regime. Amplified with Russia, Russia-Ukraine stuff, but not caused by that really. When things get hard, and you have one side of the aisle that has been so obsessed over, again, language, inclusive language things. It's they're going to have a difficult time pivoting to, let's say, someone like a Jared Polis from Colorado, who is a lot more practical. Obviously horrible about most things, as there's always that caveat with just about any politician we talk about. But he's a lot more of a practical guy than AOC or the mayor of Chicago, right? And can the Democratic Party in its current makeup, with its current base, even pivot to someone more like him as the future than doubling down on this? Because again, the whole reason we ended up with Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee is because you had all these different wings get completely rejected by voters, and it kind of just settled for Obama's VP. It is a talent issue coupled with a massive ideological fissure between, again, what Democratic activists are talking about and those sort of middle swing voters that have so often made up the Democratic coalition.
Yeah, the religion thing, of course, is one big issue too. The Democratic Party has increasingly become the party of atheist white people, and so they love making fun of anyone who's remotely religious. And right, why do people worship some sky man, or the floating spaghetti monster was I believe is a term from South Park. And so these people are just silly and ridiculous. And I saw a tweet by Flores the other day, and this was on her campaign thing. I mean, she didn't say this on her official Twitter handle for herself as a member of Congress, but she says, "I am an ambassador of Christ, and becoming a congresswoman doesn't change that. Our country belongs to God, not a political party. I am here to win souls for God. Hallelujah." And I guess I don't really necessarily disagree with anything in that tweet, but that's definitely not the sort of thing I would write. And culturally, it's not exactly the world I come from. But I'm like, okay, this is how evangelicals talk, right? This is that world. But boy, the responses to the tweet, right? Just mentioning Jesus. Again, this wasn't the official congressional thing. This was like her personal opinions. The responses, just that you mention Jesus, that makes you a a Christo-fascist was the term that was being thrown around on Twitter. Like virtually all of the white people came around to chime in on this thing about how Christians are absurd, ridiculous idiots, and all they want to do is all they want is to impose their ways on us, and they're fascists and they're basically Nazis, and you people are stupid, etc., etc. And I'm like, do they talk like this? Do they mention about how everyone who loves Jesus is a fascist and a fool? Does that play well with Hispanics? And of course, there's a stereotype that Hispanics are in the United States or they come to the United States and they're Catholics. That's not necessarily true. A fair number leave the Catholic Church, but not entirely. Often, my uncle, for example, was, of course, growing up as Mexican American in the 50s, was baptized Catholic and all of that stuff. But he also worked for an evangelical church as a drug addiction counselor. So he kind of talked like Flores a lot of the time in this tweet. And he had that cultural aspect to him, even though he was also sort of a practicing Catholic. So there's a lot of like go back and forth there. And then when Hispanics leave Catholicism or they cease to become terribly active, they often just become evangelicals, which makes their politics even more right-wing and Republican in a lot of cases. And you don't have a whole lot flocking to atheism or the sort of thing that's popular in Berkeley. But on Twitter, at least, that's the dominant mode of conversation on the left. And I wonder how much that bleeds into daily life or into when they're walking neighborhoods. Do they just pretend to respect these people then and then go back to their party headquarters and talk about what stupid rubes all these Hispanics are because they believe in God and stuff? I mean, there seems to be just a natural demographic divide there.
Yeah, the evangelical Catholic divide in South America is very interesting. It's playing out even a big role in some like Brazilian politics, where the evangelical wing, you're more likely to be a Bolsonaro supporter. Brazilian Catholics are more likely to support the left wing party right now, and that's going to be something that's going to be very interesting just to watch, over the coming years. But you're right, and you've had. I think you're going to end up seeing. On its own right, there's kind of this interesting divide within the sort of populist demographic on the right. There was some articles talking about barstool conservatism last year, which was basically sort of this sort of Dave Portnoy with Barstool Sports. He started engaging in political stuff. I think he interviewed Trump at one point, and it was basically kind of like frat bro conservatism, where it was, they were big on, praising the economic policies of Trump, but almost had captured with a sort of culturally liberal sort of aesthetic. I don't want to use the physically conservative, socially liberal thing, but like that's kind of what this core is. And then after the Dobbs decision, you had Portnoy and some of these figures talk about how big of a disaster this was, because, where they kind of saw, to the extent that they have any deeper political ideas at all, they kind of saw, okay, well, we could kind of ignore cultural aspects of the right that we don't like, because while they might talk about getting rid of Roe v. Wade, obviously it's never going to happen, which is an opinion I held myself, so I can't fault him for having that viewpoint. And so therefore, the only thing that matters is, what's going to make me more money. I think now that we're in a post-Dobbs world, where I think, particularly at the state level, perhaps less so nationally, these culture war issues, part because of the success Ron DeSantis has had, a part because of if you start seeing more active roles within kind of fighting back against indoctrination in the school system, that itself is going to require a more explicit cultural worldview in the curriculum that comes next, right? That might end up being something where you have some of those social liberal, low tax people maybe be a coalition that a more pragmatic Jared Polis style Democratic Party could attract in the future, and perhaps these sort of secular versus Christian, or even we can kind of I think even to a certain extent it's even broader than Christian. I think you see some of the particularly if you look at global perspective, Hindu nationalists and things like that. People that have, let's call it, a more traditional worldview, believe in a power higher than themselves and their own reason. I think that that versus sort of the purely secular perspective, that might end up being a fault line itself that has ramifications not only in American politics but globally. And of course, that can come to some very interesting conversations about what a global reset looks like in international relations after all the mess that's going on now. But that will definitely be a certain show, another show down the line.
Well, we'll have to go ahead and wrap up with that then. I think we'll return to this issue a little bit when we start maybe handicapping some of the races as we get closer to November and looking at maybe which states are going to go which direction and so on. But until then, thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard, and we'll see you next time.